Wren Holloway had spent 3 years memorizing the Harrington Gala the way other people memorized scripture. Every detail catalogued and cross-referenced until the entire evening existed as a kind of architecture only she could see the load-bearing walls of. She arrived at the Windmore estate at noon, 6 hours before the first guest would set foot on the lawn, carrying a binder thick with vendor confirmations, seating charts revised for the 4th time that week, and a contingency list for every disaster she'd personally witnessed or heard whispered about from galas past. The year the ice sculpture melted before cocktail hour. The year a soloist's flight got cancelled and Wren had found a replacement cellist within 90 minutes. The year a major donor's allergy hadn't been flagged and Wren had quietly, without credit, rewritten the entire dessert course 2 days before the event. None of those saves had her name attached to them publicly. All of them had kept the Harrington Gala's reputation intact for the committee that took the bows. She'd built her entire professional identity around being indispensable and invisible in the same breath. A paradox she'd stopped questioning somewhere around her 2nd year, when she'd finally understood that the two qualities weren't actually in tension at Bianca Sutterlow's gala. They were the job description. Bianca ran the event like a court, and Wren's competence had always been safe to keep close as long as it stayed entirely behind the velvet rope separating staff from guests, the caterer's tent from the ballroom, the woman who solved every crisis from the donors who never had to know a crisis existed at all. She walked the grounds methodically that afternoon, checking each vendor station against her master list, greeting the florist by name, confirming the string quartet setup had accounted for the estate's notoriously unpredictable acoustics near the West Terrace. The Windmore estate sprawled across 11 acres of manicured lawn and centuries-old oak trees. The main house, a restored Georgian mansion that photographed beautifully for the society pages the gala always attracted, and Wren had learned every inch of it across 3 years the way a sailor learns a familiar coastline. Which doors stuck in humid weather, which outlets tended to trip the breaker if too many warmers ran at once, which hallway echoed in a way that made whispered staff conversations carry further than anyone intended. Wren had grown up watching her grandfather restore antique navigational instruments in his garage workshop, learning patience and precision from a man who'd never once made her feel like her size or her quietness disqualified her from being taken seriously. He'd spent 40 years running a small clock and instrument repair shop 3 towns over from where Wren had grown up, and she'd spent every summer of her childhood perched on a stool beside his workbench, watching his weathered hands coax broken mechanisms back to life with a patience that felt, even then, like its own kind of love language. He taught her to read a compass's internal balance the way other grandfathers taught fishing or baseball, and she'd absorbed the lessons so completely that even now, years after his death, she could close her eyes and feel exactly where a needle's calibration had drifted just from the weight of the instrument in her palm. He'd died 4 years ago, leaving her his workbench, his tools, and a compass so old the maker's mark had nearly worn away. A piece she'd spent the last several months carefully restoring in the evenings after gala prep, cleaning the brass housing, resetting the needle's calibration, treating the leather case until it had softened back into something supple and beautiful. She hadn't planned to give it away. She'd planned to keep it on her own shelf, a private inheritance nobody else needed to understand the value of, something that belonged to her alone in a life where very little else did. That plan had changed 3 weeks earlier when Bianca, short-staffed and visibly anxious about a major new donor family she'd spent months courting, had told Wren, almost as an afterthought, barely looking up from her clipboard, that she'd need her on the floor this year instead of buried in the logistics tent. "We're thin on hosts," Bianca had said, tapping her pen against a roster that already had 3 names crossed out. "You know the guest list better than anyone. Might as well put a face to all that spreadsheet work. Try to look presentable." The last 2 words had landed with their usual small sting, the kind of comment Bianca delivered so casually she likely didn't remember making it 5 minutes later, and Wren had absorbed it the way she absorbed most things Bianca said about her appearance, quietly, without visible reaction, filing it away in the same mental drawer where she kept 3 years' worth of similar remarks. But underneath the sting, something else had sparked too. She'd said yes before she'd fully processed what was being offered, 3 years of careful invisibility suddenly cracking open into something that felt, for one dizzying moment, like being seen. She'd spent the following weeks torn between excitement and a low, persistent dread, uncertain how to exist in a room she'd only ever managed from its edges. She'd asked her roommate, Delia, for advice on what to wear, and Delia, A physical therapist with a blunt, kind way of cutting through Ren's spirals, had simply said, "Wear something you actually like and stop trying to disappear into the wallpaper for one night. You've earned the right to take up space at your own event." When she'd learned during her research into the season's confirmed guests, that Constantine Dragulescu, the gala's most reclusive and sought-after prospective donor, had mentioned in an old interview his fascination with antique navigational instruments. A passing comment buried in a decade-old profile most people would have scrolled past entirely. Something in her had settled on a decision before she'd fully talked herself out of it. She'd wrap her grandfather's compass for the White Elephant donor exchange, not because she expected anything from it, but because for once she wanted to give something that actually meant something instead of simply managing the evening from behind the scenes. She'd almost changed her mind twice in the weeks that followed. Once, standing in front of her bedroom mirror with the compass in hand, she'd nearly convinced herself it was too personal, too precious, too likely to be misunderstood by a room full of people who traded in curated luxury rather than sentiment. But she'd thought of her grandfather's hands, steady and patient, and of his voice telling her that the best gifts were the ones that actually meant something to the giver, not the ones that simply cost the most. She'd wrapped it the morning of the gala, brown paper and twine, the same careful attention she gave every detail nobody ever asked her to care about, and placed it on the gift table among crystal decanters and cashmere throws and one absurd bottle of century-old cognac, feeling something unfamiliar and fragile flutter in her chest as she stepped back to look at the modest, handmade parcel sitting among all that curated luxury. She had no way of knowing, standing there in the golden late afternoon light with her heart beating a little too fast, that within 4 hours her grandfather's compass would be thrown into a discard pile in front of 300 guests, or that the man walking toward that pile would change the entire shape of her life before the evening was through. The gala reached its full swing by 8, string quartet threading through the crowd's low murmur, the Windmore Estates ballroom glowing under chandeliers Wren had personally confirmed were rewired just that week after a flickering bulb nearly derailed the whole ambience during setup. She worked the floor with a careful, practiced smile, greeting guests by name, redirecting confused arrivals toward the correct seating, absorbing the specific vertigo of finally standing where she'd spent 3 years watching from a distance. The dress she'd chosen, deep emerald, cut to fit her the way she actually looked rather than some idealized version of herself, felt strange against her skin in a room full of people who'd spent considerably more on their outfits, but she kept her shoulders back the way Delia had coached her, refusing to shrink even as old instincts whispered that shrinking was safer. She caught Bianca's eye once across the room, a brief nod of approval that Wren felt disproportionately grateful for, 3 years of quiet labor finally, momentarily, acknowledged. She spent nearly an hour circulating, checking in with the catering staff, smoothing a minor seating dispute between 2 donor families with old, unspoken tension between them, doing the invisible work that had always defined her role even as she now did it in full view of the guests she usually only managed from behind the scenes. The White Elephant exchange began at 9, guests gathering around the gift table with the particular delighted anticipation reserved for expensive people pretending a game had real stakes. Bianca presided over the reveal with practiced showmanship, unwrapping items one by one, narrating each with the kind of performed enthusiasm that made every gift sound like a treasure regardless of its actual merit. A guest had brought a bottle of exceedingly rare scotch, prompting appreciative murmurs. Another had contributed a small, tasteful painting from a gallery everyone at the table seemed to recognize by name. Bianca handled each reveal with the same polished flourish, building anticipation, milking every laugh, clearly enjoying her role as the evening's master of ceremonies. She reached Wren's compass near the middle of the table, tearing the brown paper with a flourish before her expression shifted, the performed warmth curdling into something sharper the moment she registered what she was actually holding. "Oh." Bianca turned the compass over once, her tone flattening into something dismissive, pitched to carry across the gathered crowd. "This looks like it came from someone's garage sale." She glanced toward her assistant, a young man hovering nearby with a tray of discarded wrapping paper. "Throw it in the reject pile. We're not running a flea market here." The laughter that followed arrived thin and uneasy, the specific sound of a room performing agreement with someone they were afraid to contradict rather than genuine amusement. Wren felt the floor of the evening drop out from beneath her, humiliation landing with a precision that stole the breath from her lungs entirely. She watched the assistant carry her grandfather's compass toward a growing pile of rejected lesser gifts, A chipped mug, a dollar store candle, items clearly meant as jokes, and felt something in her chest crack open in a way 3 years of careful invisibility had never once prepared her for. She said nothing. Some old, deeply ingrained instinct told her that objecting now in front of 300 guests would only compound the humiliation into something even more unbearable. The difficult staff member, the one who couldn't take a joke, the one who'd embarrassed herself twice in one evening instead of once. She stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, watching her grandfather's careful restoration work get discarded like garbage, and felt every fragile hope she'd carried into this room collapse into something small and cold and familiar. She thought in that suspended, humiliating moment of every other room where her competence had arrived with an asterisk. The internship where a supervisor had once commented on her lunch choices in front of the whole office. The family gatherings where relatives praised her organizational skills in the same breath they suggested she try harder with her appearance. She thought she'd built enough armor over the years to withstand exactly this kind of public dismissal. Standing there watching her grandfather's compass disappear into a pile of jokes and rejects, she understood that no amount of armor ever fully protected against watching something you loved get treated as worthless in front of a crowd. She didn't notice the man crossing the room until he was already at the discard pile, moving with a quiet, deliberate purpose that cut directly through the crowd's aimless mingling. Constantine Dragulescu, tall, dark-suited, carrying the particular stillness of a man who'd learned long ago that he never needed to raise his voice to command a room's attention, bypassed the curated luxury table entirely, ignoring the crystal decanters and cashmere throws, and reached directly into the reject pile. He lifted the compass with a care that made Ren's breath catch, turning it over in his palm, studying the brass housing and the worn leather case with an attention that carried genuine focused interest rather than idle curiosity. He opened the compass slowly, examining the interior mechanism, and something in his expression shifted into unmistakable recognition. This engraving. His voice carried easily across the suddenly quieter room, precise and unhurried, addressing the crowd without seeming to perform for it at all. This is Andrei Voiku's work. He stopped taking commissions in the early 60s. I've spent 11 years trying to locate a second piece of his, and I'd nearly given up believing one still existed outside a museum collection. He looked up, scanning the gathered faces with an expression that had shifted from curiosity into something considerably more focused. Who chose this gift? The silence that followed carried a different texture than the earlier uneasy laughter. 300 guests waiting to understand exactly what had just happened. Why the evening's most sought-after prospective donor had reached past every curated luxury item on the table for something that had just been publicly discarded as garbage. Bianca's composure flickered visibly, something calculating moving behind her eyes as she scrambled to reclaim control of a moment that had slipped entirely outside her management. That was a staff contribution, she said, her voice arriving thin, considerably less certain than her earlier dismissal had been. I'm sure we can find you something more suited to your collection, Mr. Dragulescu. I'm not interested in something more suited. Constantine's voice stayed level, though something underneath it carried unmistakable finality. I'm interested in the person who recognized this maker's work well enough to choose it specifically for tonight's exchange, and who apparently restored it with considerable care. He turned toward the room again, waiting, patient in a way that made the silence stretch longer and heavier with every passing second. Ren felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward her before she'd fully decided whether to step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that made the room's edges blur slightly. She crossed the small distance between the crowd's edge and the discard table with legs that felt unsteady beneath her, aware of Bianca's furious, calculating stare tracking her every step. Aware too of the whispers already beginning to ripple through the nearest tables. It was mine. Ren's voice arrived quieter than she intended, though it carried in the room's expectant hush. The compass. I chose it because you mentioned in an old interview that you collected navigational instruments. I didn't know it was Voiku's work specifically. I just knew it was well made, and my grandfather taught me how to restore pieces like it before he passed. You restored this yourself? Something in Constantine's expression shifted further, genuine curiosity replacing the earlier focused recognition. The needle calibration alone would have taken considerable patience. Most restorers rush that step and ruin the mechanism's accuracy permanently. I took my time with it. Ren felt something steady slightly in her chest, professional confidence surfacing despite the humiliation still burning at the edges of her composure. My grandfather always said rushing a restoration was the same as disrespecting the person who originally made the piece. I didn't want to disrespect Voiku's work, even before I knew whose work it actually was. That's precisely correct. Constantine studied her with an attention that carried none of the assessing gazes she usually braced for from wealthy guests, something closer to genuine respect settling into his expression instead. Would you walk me through what you noticed about the engraving? I'm curious whether you identified anything beyond the maker's general reputation. Ren found herself, despite the lingering sting of Bianca's public humiliation, sliding into the comfortable rhythm of expertise she rarely got to display in front of anyone who actually cared to listen. She explained the specific styling of the compass rose, the particular way Voiku had signed his pieces in a location most collectors overlooked, the subtle asymmetry in the housing that distinguished authentic work from the forgeries that had apparently flooded the market in recent decades. She spoke about the specific alloy her grandfather had taught her to recognize by weight alone, about the particular patina that only developed over 8 decades of honest use rather than artificial aging. Constantine listened with complete, undivided attention, occasionally asking sharp, precise questions that assumed she already understood considerably more than most people would have credited her with. The rest of the room watched this exchange unfold with a fascination that had nothing to do with polite curiosity and everything to do with witnessing in real time, the evening's entire hierarchy quietly inverting itself. Bianca stood at the edge of the gathered crowd, her earlier confident composure entirely dissolved, watching a woman she'd publicly humiliated 90 seconds earlier become the most interesting person in a room full of people she'd spent months trying to impress. Ren noticed several guests pulling out their phones, discreetly capturing the moment, and understood with a distant, dizzying clarity that whatever was happening right now would be discussed at dinner tables across the city by morning. I'd like you to join our table for the remainder of the evening, Constantine said finally, once the immediate crowd had begun dispersing back into their own conversations. I have considerably more questions about restoration work, and I suspect this ballroom's music makes detailed conversation about engraving styles somewhat difficult to sustain. Ren glanced toward Bianca, whose expression carried a complicated mixture of fury and force, performing graciousness. Of course, Bianca said, the words arriving strained, barely disguising the venom underneath them. Whatever accommodates our guests. Ren followed Constantine toward his table, feeling the weight of 300 watching eyes settle around her with an intensity she'd never once experienced in 3 years of careful invisibility, understanding with sudden, dizzying clarity that whatever had just happened had permanently altered something about her place in this particular world. She sat carefully at the edge of his table, uncertain of the etiquette required of a staff member suddenly elevated to guest status, and found the other men and women at the table watching her with open, unguarded curiosity rather than the polite dismissal she'd braced for. Constantine returned to the Foundation's offices 4 times over the following 3 weeks, always requesting Ren specifically, always arriving with genuine questions rather than performing interest designed to flatter her into something she wasn't. I keep thinking about what you said regarding restoration versus preservation, he said during his 3rd visit, settling into the chair across from her cramped logistics desk with the particular ease of someone who'd stopped noticing the modest surroundings weeks ago. That restoring a piece to function, rather than simply preserving its appearance, honors the maker's original intent more completely. I've been reconsidering how my own collection is maintained, based entirely on that distinction. It's not a complicated idea. Ren kept her tone light, though something warm moved through her chest at the observation, at being taken seriously by someone whose attention carried actual weight in rooms she rarely occupied. Most collectors want objects that look impressive on a shelf. My grandfather cared more about whether a compass could still find true north after 50 years of neglect. That distinction matters considerably more than most people realize. Constantine studied her with genuine interest rather than the assessing gazes she'd grown accustomed to bracing for. I'd like your opinion on something else if you're willing to offer it. The Foundation's donor programming has grown increasingly disconnected from the actual causes it claims to support. I think that disconnection traces back to decisions being made by people who've never once had to understand what those causes actually require practically on the ground. Ren felt her guard rise instinctively, old habits of careful self-protection resurfacing even as something in her wanted, desperately, to trust the genuine curiosity in his voice. I'm not sure why you're asking me. I coordinate seating charts and vendor contracts. I'm not a program strategist. You've been running this gala's actual logistics for 3 years, correctly anticipating problems before they happen, adjusting for donor needs nobody else on the committee bothers tracking. Constantine's voice carried quiet, unhurried certainty. That's not seating charts, Ren. That's institutional knowledge nobody has bothered to formally recognize, let alone compensate you appropriately for. The observation landed with a precision that startled her, cutting directly to something she'd avoided fully articulating even to herself across 3 years of unpaid overtime and uncredited crisis management. I appreciate you noticing that. I'm still not sure what you're actually asking me. I'd like your instincts involved in how the Foundation's giving is structured going forward. Not as a favor. As compensation, formal work that uses what you actually know. Constantine met her eyes directly, something careful in the offer's delivery. I understand if that feels sudden, or if you're wary of becoming this year's discovery, paraded around as a novelty until the interest fades. I'd rather you take time to decide than say yes out of gratitude for one evening at a gift table. Ren studied him for a long moment, feeling the shape of the offer settle against 3 years of careful, guarded invisibility. She thought of every previous instance where someone's sudden interest in her had eventually curdled into something transactional, every relationship, professional or otherwise, that had ultimately revealed itself as leverage rather than genuine regard. She wanted badly to believe this was different. She'd learned painfully not to trust that instinct without testing it first. I need to think about it, she said finally, honest in a way that had become easier to access over the last 3 weeks of genuine, unhurried attention. Not because I doubt your sincerity. Because I've spent years being useful to people who never once considered making that usefulness visible or valued. I want to say yes for the right reasons, not because I'm still recovering from watching my grandfather's compass get thrown in a discard pile 3 weeks ago. That's a fair distinction. Something in Constantine's expression carried genuine respect rather than impatience. Take whatever time you need. Delia, when Ren relayed the conversation that evening over dinner, had listened with her usual blunt attentiveness before offering an assessment that cut directly through Ren's spiraling uncertainty. You've spent 3 years proving your worth to people who never once bothered to notice. This man noticed within 30 seconds of meeting you, and he's kept noticing for 3 weeks without asking anything in return. I'm not saying trust him blindly. I'm saying maybe stop assuming the worst version of every good thing that happens to you. The conversation should have ended there, comfortable and unresolved in the way that suggested trust building at its own careful pace. Instead, Ren's phone buzzed with a message from Bianca that evening, summoning her to an emergency meeting the following morning. A summons that arrived with a formality Ren had never once received in 3 years of employment, and that carried, underneath its polished language, an unmistakable current of threat. Bianca's office carried none of its usual polished warmth when Ren arrived the next morning, the space rearranged into something considerably more formal. 2 board members Ren recognized from annual meetings seated on either side of Bianca's desk like a tribunal assembling itself. We need to discuss the incident at the gala, Bianca said, her earlier furious composure replaced now with something more calculated, more dangerous. There are concerns emerging about how that moment with Mr. Dragulescu actually unfolded. What kind of concerns? Ren kept her voice steady despite the sudden cold spike of alarm moving through her chest, her hands folded carefully in her lap to keep them from visibly trembling. Several guests have suggested the entire exchange felt staged. Bianca's voice carried practiced, reasonable concern that didn't match the calculating glint in her eyes. A carefully chosen gift, precisely timed to attract our most sought-after prospective donors' attention. It raises questions about whether this was a genuine coincidence or a deliberate stunt designed to manufacture a moment, potentially embarrassing this committee in the process. Ren felt the floor of the meeting shift beneath her, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity exactly what was happening. Bianca, sensing her own leverage with Constantine slipping away, had constructed a narrative calculated to discredit Ren before that slipping leverage could translate into anything Bianca couldn't control. That's not what happened. I chose that gift weeks before the gala, based on an old interview. I had no way of knowing Mr. Dragulescu would react the way he did, And I certainly didn't orchestrate my own public humiliation as some kind of manufactured moment. I understand how it might feel that way to you. Bianca's tone carried the particular condescension of someone performing sympathy while delivering a threat. But the board needs to consider how this looks from the outside. A staff member's personal item, positioned in a way that happens to capture our most important donor's exclusive attention, followed by weeks of private meetings between the two of you. I'd hate for this to become a story that damages the Foundation's reputation, or your own position here. The threat arrived clearly enough that Ren didn't need further explanation to understand its shape, comply with whatever narrative Bianca needed, or risk losing the job she'd built her entire professional identity around for 3 years. One of the board members, a heavy-set man Ren remembered from previous annual meetings, shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing, and Ren understood, watching his silence, exactly how quickly this room could turn if she didn't defend herself immediately and clearly. Are you threatening to fire me over a story you've fabricated to protect your own standing with Mr. Dragulescu? Ren felt her voice steady as she said it, old instincts toward diplomatic silence warring visibly against something newer, sharper, that refused to simply absorb the accusation quietly. I'm protecting this committee's integrity. Bianca's composure sharpened into something considerably colder. You do well to remember that your position here has always depended on staying within the boundaries the committee sets for you. Those boundaries don't include private donor relationships that happen to elevate your own profile at the committee's expense. Ren left the meeting with her hands trembling, the old, familiar fear rising with a force she hadn't felt since the discard pile 3 weeks earlier. Not fear of the accusation itself, since there was no truth to the fabrication Bianca had constructed, but fear of the exhausting familiar pattern repeating itself exactly the way it always had, a woman with more institutional power deciding unilaterally what Ren's competence and honesty were worth. She sat in her car in the parking lot for nearly 15 minutes afterward, replaying every word, cataloging every threat buried beneath Bianca's polished language, trying to determine whether there was any version of the coming weeks that didn't end with her losing everything she'd spent 3 years building. She called Constantine that evening, uncertain whether reaching out crossed some boundary neither of them had fully defined yet. Bianca's threatening my job, she said without preamble, the words arriving unsteady despite her effort to sound composed. She's telling the board the gift exchange was staged, that I orchestrated the whole thing to manufacture attention. I don't know how to fight a story like that from inside an organization where she controls the entire narrative. You don't need to fight it alone. Constantine's voice carried quiet, immediate resolve. I'll be direct about my intentions with the board myself. But I want to be clear about something first. I'm not going to simply rescue you from this. I'm going to make my continued support conditional on terms that force the board to actually reckon with what's happening, rather than letting Bianca's version of events stand unchallenged. What does that mean practically? It means my future donations depend explicitly on your continued involvement in the Foundation's programming, formally on the record. Something harder moved into his voice. The board will have to choose between Bianca's fabricated narrative and their largest benefactor's stated terms. I suspect that choice will clarify itself very quickly once actual money is on the line. The 3 days before the emergency board meeting carried a tension Ren hadn't fully anticipated, spent gathering every piece of documentation she'd quietly accumulated over 3 years. Donor feedback notes, vendor negotiation records, the informal ledger of small crises she'd solved without anyone ever formally acknowledging the labor involved. She spent the first evening at her kitchen table with Delia, sorting through 3 years of accumulated notebooks and email threads, feeling a complicated mixture of vindication and exhaustion at seeing the full scope of what she'd actually been managing laid out in front of her for the first time. This is insane, Delia said, paging through one of the notebooks. You've been running this entire operation. Bianca's been taking credit for work she didn't even know the details of. I know. Ren felt something steady settle into her chest at finally saying it aloud, 3 years of quiet resentment finally given permission to exist openly. I think some part of me always knew, but it felt safer to just keep doing the work than to actually name what was happening. The emergency board meeting convened 3 days later, gathering the full committee in a conference room considerably more formal than Bianca's earlier tribunal, Constantine present at the board's specific request given his stated conditions attached to future funding. I want to address the concerns raised about the gala incident directly, Bianca said, opening the meeting with practiced confidence that Ren recognized now as performance rather than genuine certainty. I believe the sequence of events raises legitimate questions about staff conduct and appropriate boundaries with major donors. I'd like to hear Ren's account before this conversation goes any further, one of the board members said, an older woman named Denise who'd always struck Ren as more attentive than most of the committee's other members. We've heard Bianca's characterization. We haven't yet heard directly from the person actually being characterized. Ren felt something steady in her chest at the invitation. 3 years of careful invisibility finally giving way to a moment she'd never expected to be handed so directly. I chose that compass 3 weeks before the gala, based on research I did into Mr. Dragulescu's publicly stated interests. That's not staged. That's exactly the same diligence I've applied to every seating chart and vendor negotiation for this gala over the last 3 years. She reached into her bag, producing a folder she'd assembled the previous evening, spreading its contents across the table. I've also kept detailed records of donor feedback for every gala I've coordinated, informal notes nobody asked me to keep but that I maintained anyway because I believed the information mattered. Preferences, concerns, small details that improved every subsequent event. I'd like the board to actually see the scope of what I've been managing unpaid and uncredited for 3 years, separate entirely from anything involving Mr. Dragulescu. She distributed copies around the table, watching several board members' expressions shift as they paged through 3 years of meticulous, uncredited institutional knowledge, vendor negotiations that had saved the foundation considerable money, donor preferences tracked with a precision that explained, suddenly, why the gala had run so smoothly for 3 consecutive years despite Bianca's public credit for that success. This is considerably more thorough than anything I've seen from Bianca's own reporting, Denise said, studying the documents with visible surprise. Bianca, were you aware of the extent of this work? I was aware Ren handled logistics competently. Bianca's composure had begun visibly cracking, the careful performance from earlier giving way to something more defensive. I wasn't aware she'd been keeping unauthorized records outside her formal job responsibilities. They weren't unauthorized, Ren said, direct in a way that had become considerably easier to access over the last 3 weeks. They were simply unrequested because nobody on this committee ever asked what actually made this gala successful year after year. I did the work because I cared about it mattering, not because anyone offered me credit or compensation proportional to what I was contributing. Constantine, who'd remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke, his voice carrying the same unhurried certainty that had first stopped an entire ballroom weeks earlier. I'd like the board to understand my position clearly, since it seems relevant to whatever decision you're weighing today. My continued financial support for this foundation is contingent on Ren's formal compensated involvement in programming decisions going forward. Not because of any personal relationship between us, though I won't pretend one hasn't developed. Because the documentation just distributed demonstrates institutional value this committee has spent 3 years extracting without appropriate recognition, and I'm not interested in funding an organization that treats its most capable staff member as disposable scenery. The room went very still, and Ren watched Bianca's carefully constructed narrative finally, completely collapse in front of the one audience whose opinion had always carried more weight than anyone else's in this particular hierarchy. Bianca's expression cycled through several failed recoveries before settling into something raw and cornered, the calculated composure she'd maintained throughout the meeting finally, visibly dissolving. This is absurd. You're allowing a donor's personal preference to dictate internal staffing decisions. I'm allowing our largest benefactor's explicitly stated terms to inform a decision this board should have made independently years ago, based on merit alone. Denise's voice carried quiet, final authority, cutting through Bianca's faltering objection. The documentation in front of us demonstrates exactly the kind of institutional knowledge this foundation has been benefiting from without appropriate acknowledgement. That's not a donor relationship problem. That's a management failure this board bears direct responsibility for. I've run this gala successfully for years. Bianca's voice climbed, something desperate surfacing beneath the crumbling composure. I don't understand why one uncomfortable incident at a gift table is being weighed against years of my own leadership. Because the incident revealed a pattern this board should have noticed independently. Another board member spoke for the first time, his tone carrying quiet disapproval. publicly humiliating a staff member in front of 300 guests, then attempting to discredit her when a major donor's genuine interest threatened your own standing. That's not an isolated lapse in judgment, Bianca. That's a demonstration of exactly how you've been managing this organization's most valuable, least visible resource. Ren watched the room's consensus solidify around her with a clarity she'd never once experienced in 3 years of careful, uncredited labor, feeling something steady and unfamiliar settle into her chest. Not vindication exactly, though vindication was certainly present, but something closer to the simple, overdue recognition that her competence had always deserved a name attached to it. "I'd like to propose a formal resolution," Denise said, addressing the room directly now. "Ren Holloway is promoted into a newly created programming director position, compensated appropriately for the scope of work she's already been performing, with direct authority over donor relations and gala coordination going forward. Bianca's role is restructured to remove direct oversight of staff, pending a full review of management practices within this committee." The motion carried with a swiftness that told Ren everything she needed to understand about how quickly institutional priorities could shift once actual accountability arrived attached to actual consequences. Bianca left the meeting without further argument, her authority visibly, completely dissolved in front of the exact board whose confidence she'd spent years carefully cultivating. Constantine found Ren in the hallway afterward, something unguarded moving across his face now that the confrontation had fully resolved. "You didn't need me to speak for you in there," he said, watching her with genuine respect rather than the protective concern she might have expected. "You'd already assembled everything necessary to make your own case, independent of anything I contributed. Your terms forced the meeting to happen in the first place." Ren met his eyes directly, honest in a way that had become considerably easier to access over the last month. "I'm not going to pretend that didn't matter. But you're right that I needed to stand on my own record once the room actually let me speak. I think some part of me has been quietly gathering that record for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment, even before I understood I was waiting for it." 1 year later, Ren stood at the edge of the Windmore Estates ballroom during the Harrington Gala's opening hour, watching the string quartet tune their instruments and the caterers finalize the appetizer stations with the particular satisfaction of someone who no longer needed to manage every detail personally, because she'd finally built a team capable of sharing that weight. Her programming director title had settled into something that felt 12 months in less like an unexpected gift and more like simple overdue justice. Donor relationships she now managed with genuine authority instead of invisible labor, a staff of 3 coordinators who reported to her directly and who she made certain always received public credit for their contributions. She'd rebuilt the gala's entire structure over the past year, restructuring the White Elephant Exchange, revising donor outreach to focus on genuine engagement rather than performed extravagance, and had watched with quiet satisfaction as the foundation's actual charitable output had grown alongside its budget for the first time in years. Bianca had resigned from the committee entirely within 2 months of the board's restructuring, unable to tolerate a role stripped of the authority she'd spent years accumulating, and Ren had felt, watching that resignation letter circulate, less triumph than a quiet, settled relief that the old dynamic had finally, fully dissolved. She'd heard, secondhand, that Bianca had taken a role at a smaller organization across the state, and she found she genuinely didn't think about her much anymore, the old wounds having scarred over into something manageable rather than raw. She'd kept her grandfather's compass, recovered from the discard pile the same night Constantine had first opened it, restored now to its permanent place on her office shelf rather than given away. A decision she'd made deliberately, understanding that some things deserved to stay exactly where they belonged instead of being offered up for someone else's validation. She touched it sometimes during difficult meetings, a small, grounding reminder of exactly how far the last year had carried her. Constantine found her near the gift table an hour into the gala. The evening's White Elephant Exchange arranged considerably differently this year, guests contributing items with genuine thought rather than performed extravagance, a shift Ren had quietly implemented the moment she'd gained the authority to. "You changed the exchange format," he observed, studying the modest, thoughtfully chosen gifts arranged across the table. "Nothing here costs more than $50. I wanted people to choose gifts because they meant something, not because they were performing wealth for each other." Ren allowed herself a small, genuine smile, something that had become considerably easier to access over the last year than it had been throughout the 3 years before it. I learned something important about what actually gets recognized in a room like this one, once you stop assuming expensive is the same as valuable. I think that lesson extends considerably beyond gift exchanges. Constantine studied her with the same genuine attention he'd offered from that very first evening, an attention that had never once needed her to prove anything beyond simply being honest about who she actually was. I still think about that night sometimes, the compass sitting in that discard pile, and how easily this entire year might never have happened if I'd simply walked past it the way everyone else in that room had already decided to. I think about it too. Ren met his eyes directly, honest in the way that had become her default instead of the careful exception it used to be. I spent 3 years believing invisibility was the safest way to survive rooms like this one. I'm not sure I'd have found my way out of that belief without watching my grandfather's compass end up somewhere it never should have gone, in front of witnesses who couldn't look away once you decided to. You'd have found your way eventually. Something warm and certain moved through his voice. You were always going to stop letting people like Bianca decide what your work was worth. I just happened to be standing in the right place when you finally reached the moment you were ready to prove it. Ren looked around the ballroom, the same space where she'd once stood invisible at its edges, cataloging crises nobody else would ever know she'd solved, and felt the accumulated weight of a year settle into something steady and entirely her own. She thought of every gala before this one, every uncredited save, every careful, quiet labor that had built a reputation belonging to someone else entirely, and understood finally, completely, that the man beside her had never once needed her small. He'd simply needed her to be honest, and honesty, it turned out, had been the only thing standing between her and a room where she finally, fully belonged. She took her seat at the head table 20 minutes later, not as staff finally permitted onto the floor, but as herself, present, visible, no longer hoping to be noticed, simply at last, exactly where she'd always deserved to sit. If you'd spent years being valuable but unseen, praised only for your usefulness and never for yourself, would you have kept giving that quiet labor freely the way Ren once did, or would you have demanded recognition long before a stranger finally opened the gift everyone else had already thrown away? Thank you for reading. There are more stories like this one waiting whenever you're ready for them.